I want to talk about how books come to us. And I want us to think about what happens to books before they end up in our hands, and how this can affect both what we read and our experiences of reading. So when most of us walk into a bookshop and we pick a book off the shelf, we don't necessarily think about what it takes to get it there. Maybe we have an idea of a writer toiling away in solitude in a quiet room with a quill pen or an old-timey typewriter, and we have a kind of a montage in our heads of a thick manuscript envelope being sent off, rejection letters, until eventually there's acceptance, and then we sort of jump cut to book on the shelf or a book launch or something like that. It's a bit more complicated than that. This is a diagram by Claire Squires and Ray Murray that I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on because it's complicated. This is what is called a communications circuit. And it tells us about the different stages that a book needs to go through before it gets to the reader. So to simplify things, we have an author who in the UK usually needs to convince a literary agent that they write well enough. The literary agent takes on the author and then tries to sell the manuscript to the publisher. The publisher prepares the manuscript for publication, so typesets it, edits it, does the cover design in consultation with marketing people and salespeople. And then printing companies make the book, which is then sold to various kinds of booksellers. So there's wholesalers and then retailers, that's Waterstones or that sort of bookstore. And then that's where we come in as readers and buyers of books. Because books are commodities and the book industry is fueled by sales, at every stage of a book's life, there are decisions being made about what is likely to bring in the most profit. Profit can come in different forms. The main one is economics, so that's book sales, that's money. But there's also symbolic profit, and that's one's reputation in relation to the competition. That's things like literary prizes, good reviews. That can also translate into economic profit. So if you win the Booker, there's often a huge spike in your sales, but that's not necessarily the case. Profit potential has everything to do with the reader. But I want to draw a distinction here between the real people who buy or borrow and read books and the readers and book buyers that publishers have in mind when they're making their publishing decisions. There's an important difference between the two, and I'm going to talk more about that. But what's important here is that it's the publisher's sense of the market that influences both what they choose to publish and how they present that book to the market. And I should add here that booksellers have a lot of influence in this regard as well, because they're the ones who are buying from the publishers to sell to readers. So, who are the publishers and who are they publishing for? This seems like a useful question to ask. It may not surprise you that in Britain, in the publishing industry, it has been and continues to be overwhelmingly white in composition, especially at editorial levels, the people who are choosing which books to take on and how to kind of work with the text itself. Writing the Future, which is a 2015 report that's based on hundreds of interviews with publishing industry insiders and authors, suggests that these predominantly white publishers are concentrating on a market that comprises what they called people like us. And by people like us, they mean white people, female people who are aged between 35 and 55. So again, going back to Aminata Fauna, this is something that she says. She says, there is an orthodoxy whereby the presumed reader is totally monocultural, white, Middle England. We know from looking at census data that this is a very outdated view. I think sometimes a paradigm gets created and everyone starts to subscribe to it. So there's no doubt that there is a market that fits this demographic profile. But this is not the only market. And in the future, with the demographics of Britain changing, there's a good chance that this idea of the market is going to be increasingly obsolete. But when economic times are tough, and they have been tough for the last decade, publishers tend to make more conservative decisions. They're more likely to do what they know works for a market that they know, rather than taking a risk on something different. And this has meant that writing by Black, Asian, and minority ethnic authors in the UK has been consistently underrepresented. The Writing the Future report suggests that things have actually gotten worse in the last 10 years. Statistics in the Bookseller show that out of thousands of books published last year in 2016, fewer than 100 were by non-white British authors, which is quite a shocking statistic. I think this narrowing of scope, this kind of whitewashing perhaps, is something that we see reflected in school curriculums as well. But it's not just a case of underrepresentation, it's also to some extent a case of misrepresentation. According to Writing the Future, that same report, and I quote here, "The best chance of publication for a Black, Asian, or minority ethnic novelist is to write literary fiction that conforms to a stereotypical view of Black or Asian communities. Writers are advised by agents and editors to make their manuscripts marketable in this country by upping the sari count, dealing with gang culture, or some other image that conforms to white preconceptions." In addition, the same report found that a majority of Black, Asian, minority ethnic novelists reported that their ethnicity was the main focus of their publisher's publicity campaign, rather than any more universal aspect of the book. So effectively, if you are a new Black British writer at the moment, there's a kind of pressure on you, whether implicit or explicit, not only to write a certain kind of book that maybe plays into existing cultural or racial stereotypes, but also to allow these aspects of your identity to be the most prominent thing associated with you and your writing. At worst, this potentially turns writers and books into kind of the objects of anthropological study, no longer crafters of words and worlds. I think it's important to note here that publishers are not necessarily trying to please real people, though they may be operating out of their own narrow expectations. So this is a presumed market. These are imagined readers. And of course, even those who might count as part of the white female market won't necessarily share the preferences or prejudices that publishers might be assuming. And I also want to be clear that there are writers at work who subvert these kinds of expectations in their writing or who toy with them in exciting ways. But let's think about the implication of this situation for readers. When a British writer, or what he or she writes or writes about, is presented in this way, what might it mean for white readers' experiences of this book, or their senses of themselves in relation to it? And what might it mean for Black, Asian, or minority ethnic readers' experiences of this book, or their sense of themselves? These are the questions I want us to have in the back of our minds as we move on to something more practical, which is book covers. And I think this is kind of a way in which a lot of these ideas are really clearly illustrated. So we're all familiar with the kind of shorthand language of book covers. And that's how publishers and marketers try to entice us to buy or to read a book, and how they communicate what a book genre is, what we can expect when we read it, to know if it's our kind of thing. So I'd like to ask the audience, what do you expect when you see a book that looks like this? Anyone? Anyone?
50 Shades of Grey.
You think, if you think about actually standing on this hill, I think you'd be falling forward if you see how long it is. It's definitely been photoshopped. Yeah, definitely. Something kind of like a 50 Shades of Grey ripoff, maybe. This is a case of a publisher seeing something that worked and thinking, let's get on that bandwagon. That's how things like vampire romance novel becomes a genre, right? Okay, so the funny thing is that covers are very conventional too. This is a really interesting subgenre of back of woman looking out at things at the top. You're going to see this everywhere now. From now on, I've ruined pretty much 70% of covers of literary fiction. And the one at the bottom is using the exact same image. That image comes up countless times in people's book covers, which is unfortunate for the author who thinks they're presenting something that's kind of new and original. But it's a moody picture, so yeah. Okay, so the question I want to ask now is what happens when the genre of a book becomes an entire cultural or religious identity? Again, you can see a doubled image there. And then what happens when a whole continent becomes a genre? So that any book about Africa necessarily needs to have a kind of Lion King, acacia, sunset thing going on the cover, no matter how different the actual books are within that group. So now this is a question I want to ask: does this look like a book that includes the author's experiences of living in a caravan in Scotland? So one of the things we find with Aminata Fauna, who, to be fair, grew up in Sierra Leone and Scotland, what we find is that she's consistently positioned as African in kind of the way that she's presented in the UK market. So let's look at, this is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's books, Purple Hibiscus and Half of Yellow Sun. This is in itself a kind of a fun subgenre, which is sort of blurry black woman's face with some kind of smeared colors somewhere. Now let's look at The Memory of Love. I mean, it's clearly in the same genre, right, of book covers. So Fauna is being positioned as being like Adichie. Just a fun fact is that here's a Lawrence Hill's book, Someone Knows My Name, which uses the exact same picture. It's doing the same thing, and it also won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, so The Memory of Love did as well. Okay, so now I want to sort of zip back to what we might think of as literary fiction in Britain. Can you tell me the kinds of words you might use to talk about these covers? What are the connotations that you'd have? Anyone? Nostalgia? Tasteful melancholy?
Bleak.
Sure. Pardon me?
Bleak.
Bleak,
But also bleached out.
especially on the right.
Predictable.
Predictable.
Yawn.
Yawn. Yeah.
And overrated.
Is that you just get that from the cover? It just screams overrated.
The same old story again about class and then making a movie.
I see there's a backstory to there's a background going on here, but yeah, telling the same old story. Sure. Well, let's think of that in comparison to these ones, which are also by British writers. What are some of the words you'd use to describe these? Exotic.
Colourful.
Here, let's go back. I mean, that's quite. There's some orange.
There's also, I'm really short-sighted, so I might be wrong, but the kind of child-like appeal or something. It's sort of the bright colours that often put on English children's books.
Childlike appeal.
Childlike.
I'm seeing some nods in the audience.
Infantilized appeal.
Infantilized. Do you think that's infantilizing what's on the book or infantilizing the person who's supposed to buy it?
I think just when you do the contrast of the two, this is still eye-catching, and that's why it's going to appeal, whereas the other one's like the grown-ups who, male grown-ups who are like serious.
So this one is for male grown-ups. I don't know if we're getting this. We should probably give you a mic to catch this. But
interesting the font they used in both of those. feels quite male.
Okay. Can you say that again into the microphone? Sorry, just so that we can record it. Otherwise, you're going to be sort of faint voices.
So I think the font that is used in both of those books is quite a male font, it seems to me.
Because it's got serifs on it?
Well, the atonement particularly, it's all lines and corners,
Capital
isn't
letters.
it? So,
Blocky.
which, yeah, I mean, I don't find those appealing, whereas I do find the other books
So
that's
these
much more
ones-
exotic, much more intriguing. I'm much more likely to pick those off the shelf to read.
And of course, he does have a very large, McEwan has a very large male readership. He's a top writer for male readers, yeah.
Yeah.
But is there anything wrong with that when you said publishing industry dominated by white women?
No, not white men. Actually, it
No, he said white women.
You said it was dominated by white women earlier.
by white women.
The publishing industry is,
the,
yes.
The publishing industry. Well, actually, we don't have statistics for the UK, but in the US at least, editors and publishers, I think it's like 79% are women, and I think anecdotally it's quite similar in the UK, although there is still a kind of a boys' club involved.
But there's also a question of these female, let's assume, female editors and publishers presenting McEwan in this case in a certain way to a presumed audience. There's a structure of expectations that's being played to, and there's also, I mean, it's also difficult in all these images. Assessing chicken and egg, you know, what comes first? You know, the perceptions, and those perceptions are enhanced and supported by the way in which the books are presented, and then that in turn, of course, shapes the.
Yeah, it's a feedback loop. So that's why we know what a 50 Shades of Grey lookalike book cover is, because we've come to associate that with certain kinds of books. So we've kind of been, you know, conditioned in a way as well. Okay, so now I want to move across to 3 different covers of the same book, and I'd love for people to tell me what you think. What's going on in these 3 covers? If you're not familiar with Brick Lane, it's a Booker Prize-winning novel. It largely takes place in London, I think, is something that I'll just throw out there as you look at these covers.
It's very much a woman's story.
Can we have a mic go there? Sorry,
It's very much a woman's story. Obviously, the one on the far right, which is based on the film, which I haven't seen of it, and then the middle one is clearly again that idea of women together, supporting each other. But the one on the left, I think, looks like kind of patchwork quilts. So that again is a kind of women's activity. So if it's clear that it is meant to appeal to your sense, perhaps, of the repressed Bangladeshi, I think it's Bangladeshi, is that right, woman? Yeah. And I think that kind of limits its readership. When if you go into a shop to buy that, that does very much look like a book that's designed to appeal to women who need some kind of solace in female company.
Yeah, I think there is definitely a gendered aspect to this.
But the one on the left is more neutral. It sort of feels a bit more grown up and neutral than the other two.
Sorry, just can you... I'm waiting for the mic, sorry.
It's very intimidating. Only to say that the one on the left feels more neutral and accessible to a wider market than the two on the right.
Neutral, so it's
Sort of more
it's
gender
on a
neutral,
white background.
more gender neutral for me, and less of the sort of playing on the exotic than the other two.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that, actually. That's the hardcover. I think it's the Doubleday version. It might interest you to know that the one on the left is actually the British hardcover, and these other 2 are by Scribner, which is based in New York. I don't know if that affects...
The left one was how it was published initially.
Yes.
That's what I remember. That's the first one. I think it was the paperback is also the left one.
Yeah.
And then the right one is the DVD.
Yeah, and then...
I haven't seen this one.
Yeah, I want to talk about this movie tie-in edition a little bit, because does that scream London at you at all? I mean, I would think that this is about a kind of a woman in a rural setting, maybe. Kind of, again, there's that idea of female companionship, like, and this kind of wistful, I don't know, slightly sort of, over the shoulder look. I can tell you for a fact that they made the background more orange. Because one of the things, in preparing for this presentation, I looked at a lot of different book covers, and one of the things I noticed was that you pretty much don't get an Indian book that's blue. Your color palette is sort of purple, yellow, orange, red, and it needs to be that, because otherwise people aren't going to know that it's to do with the subcontinent, African books are a bit harsher. You might get some like luminous sort of, but like angry colors. And mainly it's just sort of your sunset palette and some like harsh black silhouettes or something like that. So yeah, I think, that's what I have. But I just want to go back to this kind of contrast that we have. And for us to bear that in mind the next time we're looking on a bookshelf. Tessa.
I was also struck by how many faces from the front are on the covers of very beautiful women. And so in one way that makes it seem that the view of women looking away is actually quite liberating, because there's not going to be an unattractive woman. If there's a woman's face on the front of a book, and often from a so-called minority in terms of British culture, it's usually going to be a very attractive, beautiful, glamorous picture. And I think that often happens with the authors as well, like many of the authors we're discussing on this project. And I know you're not discussing Zadie Smith, but she's one who's never discussed without the very glamorous image of her.
Absolutely.
And so, in one way, the books could appeal to women, and the one on the right is going with the kind of Bollywood, glamorous South Asian beauty sort of thing, and that happens to Adichie as well, I think, or the...
Yeah, I think one of the things I also draw attention to is what's at stake in having the back of a woman's head rather than her face on a cover. If you're aiming at female readers, say, my feeling is that it makes that woman into a screen onto which you can project yourself. So you can imagine yourself into that character. And these are pretty much, as far as I could tell, all white women. But then you don't get that with this, because there's an underlying assumption that you can't imagine yourself into this point of view. And maybe even you can't imagine yourself into this person's point of view. So I think that's something to bear in mind as well, how that that becomes another person rather than a screen onto which you can, or a kind of a way in,
I think it's interesting how many of them don't look out at us.
Yeah.
They don't look out at us, but they're looking sideways. There's only, just as you flick through there's only 2 or 3 that are actually confronting us, if you like. Everyone else is looking aside, much more female, softer.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. There's some of that.
I feel like the more minimal a book cover is, the more it sort of subliminally reminds us of like Penguin classics and kind of the tradition of rendering very respected books in very minimal covers. So all of the cluttered ones are kind of removing them from that genre as well.
Yeah. Maybe not quite as serious. Yeah.
Definitely, the difference between the 2 greyish ones and then the colourful ones is that there's a weight and a seriousness about those, as opposed to the fun.
Yeah.
The colourful ones.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, look how crowded.
Light, fun, not serious.
This is really crowded, and then there's a kind of and again, busy stuff happening there, which is why I think the Monica Ali strikes us as being something that is more maybe, as someone said, sort of gender neutral, or maybe presented as a much more serious book.